Today I'm going to be taking a look at the classic Omega Speedmaster. It's actually my first time ever kind of handling the watch for any extended period of time. I've seen it in ADs, but I've never really owned one per se. This one was on borrow from a friend, so thank you for trusting me. And yeah, let's get into the review. So we have a diameter of 42 millimeters, lug to lug of about 47.3, height of 13.2, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for the watch, we're going to have the caliber 3861 in here. As you can see through the Sapphire case back, it focuses a little bit more clearly. There's a couple upgrades to this movement. We do now have a silicone balance spring, which helps with the anti-magnetism. This is now a coaxial movement. It is now METAS certified, so it is between 0 to +5 seconds a day in accuracy on average. Mine is around +4. What's also nice is, as opposed to the previous version, this movement is now hacking. So as you can see, when I pull out the crown, the seconds hand stops. Revolutionary. And we do have 50 meters of water resistance here, no screw down crown, so just a regular push pull. It is a hand wound chronograph movement. Other than that, we do have a domed sapphire on the front with inner AR coating, sapphire crystal on the back. This is the sapphire sandwich variation. And last but not least, this watch retails directly from Omega for $7,200. So starting with the dial here, it is the classic Speedmaster dial. The main difference between this is now there are more stepped regions. The kind of outer sub-seconds track has a little bit more stepping to it, and these sub-registers as well have a little bit more depth and stepping, so you can kind of delineate them better, tell the time a little bit better. Looking a little bit more generally, you do have the classic baton handset done in this very, very stark white, which is nice, helps with contrast against the pure black dial. You do have the chronograph running seconds here staying at the 12. If I move that out of the way, for the at least Sapphire version, you do have an applied Omega logo right there, and I believe the Hess Light just has a printed Omega logo. We have all these classic rectangular pips for every 5-minute marker. They are done in this slight greenish, creamish tone that does contrast a little bit with the white elements. It does help with, I think, legibility because it delineates what are the hands versus what are the markers, but I'm not the hugest fan of that color contrast. One really interesting update with this newer Speedmaster is the seconds track on the outside. I think it used to be 5 kind of subdivision, 5 hash marks on the very outer rim, but now it is only 3 to fit with the 3 hertz movement. I believe the old version was also 3 hertz, so I don't really know why it had 5 tick marks in the first place. But for me, it does look a little bit cleaner, a little bit less cluttered along the seconds track here, and I dig it. Overall, there really isn't much to say about this dial that probably hasn't already been said. It is classic, it is clean, it is iconic. You do have a very kind of matte black dial. Depending on the angle, it goes from very matte to almost inky, just depending on the light. You do have a decent amount of text, but it's not overdone by any means, just Omega, Speedmaster, and Professional below that. I think it's no more than needed at all. Kind of a nice triangular symmetry between the text and the top of the logo there. And you do have the delineation with the classic Speedmaster dong there at 12. I think the dial, well proportioned, it looks nice. Zooming in a little bit closer, we do see the Speedmaster does have a kind of pebbled texture on the base dial. You do see the actual depth to the stepping down of the seconds track there, which is nice. Something I didn't really notice until I got down at this angle is a lot of the 5 o'clock Lume pips are actually, I guess you can say, recessed into the dial track. And again, it's not something I ever noticed until zooming in this close, but it's one of those subtle details that add a little bit extra depth to the watch. And then trying to see the Lume pip from the side view, you can see it kind of does raise up to meet the stepped middle dial, but again, it is still recessed into the dial itself. Another small detail that you can see as we zoom in is each of these subdials has a very faint concentric circling to it. It would have been nice to see it a little bit deeper, a little bit more defined, but as it stands, it's just a cool little detail. From wrist view, it's not something I've ever really noticed, and had they been a little bit more defined, maybe it is something you could see just from the wrist. Looking at the hands themselves, they are coated in this white material. They are done fairly well. I don't see any imperfections along them. The lume fill itself doesn't seem kind of patchy or any parts missing. So it's all done pretty well. It's all done pretty cleanly. It's all finished finely. So thankfully there aren't really any QC issues that I could see. There's actually really no dust on the dial, no fibers, no misprints. All the printing is done pretty crisply and cleanly. So it's really nice to see. Moving the hand a little bit just so we can see the applied Omega logo there. there may be a slight kind of speck or dust on that logo itself. So that may be the smallest QC issue I've found on the watch. Maybe it's some scratching on the logo on that left-hand side. But even then, it's very faint. You would never notice it in day-to-day wear. And as it stands, the watch does hold up pretty well under macro. Looking at the case of this watch here, and it is the classic Speedmaster case. I do believe they made it slightly shorter in length than the previous version and maybe slightly thinner. And it does wear really nicely. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have the kind of circular grain brushing on the tops of the lugs on the inside here. Classic Omega Lyre lug. So on the surface right here, we do have a full high polished going along the entire side of the case. Looking at the side again, we do have a horizontal brushing on both sides and just the high polished Omega crown with the logo in there. Classic black tachometer bezel here with a little bit high polished along the outside. I want to say this is an aluminum bezel. It might be ceramic now. I'll have to correct that somewhere down below. I'm not 100% sure. Either way, it does have a nice kind of glossy black finish to it and contrasts pretty interestingly with the kind of grayer, more, I guess, worn-in black look of the dial at certain angles. Looking at the side of the case here, we do have a slight curvature to the mid case. It's nothing dramatic. The case back here is a little bit thicker, but it does sit almost completely into the wrist, so you do get this nice thin mid case that shows in kind of this thinner top portion along with the domed crystal. So effectively on wrist, it doesn't seem very thick at all. It's probably closer to a 10mm wearing watch, and that's nice. Looking at the bracelet here, it is this new 5-link bracelet from Omega. In the original photos, I thought it was kind of weird because the mid-link does stay the same size the whole way, but the outer links do shrink in size as it goes down. It does taper from 20mm to 14 at the clasp, so it is a pretty dramatic taper. But honestly, I do like how it looks on wrist. It has a vintage feel about it. It looks nice. It kind of cuts a little bit of the visual heft of the watch itself. Looking at the clasp here, it has a very much more vintage than modern feel about it. You have these lines going across and the Omega logo at the very top, almost as if it is a friction fit clasp that you're supposed to latch onto there. It is a push button deployant and it isn't too bad. It opens and closes nicely and it's easy to actuate, but sometimes, at least in my experience, when I'm pushing the button, sometimes it doesn't want to come off. So your mileage may vary. Maybe it's just a kind of problem with my clasp, but that's just something to keep in mind. You also do have 2 holes of micro adjust here in the clasp. It would have been nice to see more, and because this kind of micro adjust is a little bit weird looking, I mean, it does keep in line with the lines of the actual clasp itself, but it's kind of an extra link in a way that just looks a little bit weird. To me, it seems almost like an afterthought, especially since they only gave it 2 holes of micro adjust in this kind of pseudo extra link here. But overall, the taper is nice, the links are thin, you do have screw links, it does conform to the wrist really nicely, it does drape really nicely, there's kind of enough space in between so it doesn't have a lot of heat buildup. It's a really nice bracelet, and I do like how it complements the watch because now it is a kind of female end-link bracelet. It allows the watch to wear a little bit more sleekly on wrist, it doesn't extend the length of the watch in any way, so it really does help it wear a lot better than it used to. And then just speaking really quickly on the crown here, for me, I think it is a little small or at least a little bit hard to actuate. I don't know if the gripping needs to be better or the crown needs to be slightly bigger, but I do find it a little bit hard to wind the watch. It isn't the most difficult thing to do, but it does feel like the knurling needs to be slightly better or slightly grippier or whatever the term would be. But other than that, pushers actuate pretty nicely, nice mechanical click to them, and winds very smoothly. Taking a quick look at the case back here, what's nice is with the Sapphire version, you do get a lot of, in a way, skeletonization. I don't think it's necessarily purposely done, it's just the way the chronograph is set up. You do see a lot of gears, you do see the balance wheel spinning away. And then as you actuate the chronograph itself, you can see all the parts moving over here. I mean, to be fair, how often are you going to be using the chronograph and not looking at the front of the watch? But hey, it at least is a little bit of a fun detail in case you just want to play around and you're bored one day. Taking a quick look at the movement under macro, it isn't necessarily the most pretty or high-end movement to look at. It is a little bit industrial, but it is nice to see the amount of skeletonization here. It is nice to see all the gears turning away, the pallet fork beating away. And while the movement itself isn't badly finished, it is not high-end necessarily. You do have a lot of kind of dirt and debris and dust on the screws or on the various plates. As you can see, it is not the best finished movement in the world, but it is still nice to look at and maybe worth springing for the extra sapphire back option. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing my Chrono here, and here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and honestly for a 42mm it doesn't wear badly at all. It still sits comfortably within the outer edges of my wrist. It's not too long on the lug to lug. I think the black dial, I mean naturally darker colors tend to shrink, so the black doesn't look as expansive as maybe a white dial Speedmaster would. It's not too thick on the wrist either. It doesn't feel overly thick, it doesn't feel overly bulky, which is nice. And it doesn't feel overly sharp at any angle either, so it is comfortable to wear. Looking at the watch from a side view, as you can see, it does hug the wrist fairly well. It doesn't sit completely flush, but it also doesn't rise off the wrist too high either. It's again pretty comfortable. As you kind of flex, it does sit into the wrist really nicely. You do still have those female end links, so it doesn't flare out at all. I think also because the bracelet now has such a finer link profile to it in general, it just drapes a lot easier, it wears a lot more comfortably, and the taper also helps, again, take away some of that visual weight away from the watch. So all in all, this is really fantastic wearing. If I just looked at the specs on paper, I could have probably written off this watch and thought, it probably won't work for me, but honestly, I think it does fit well. It's definitely a size I can pull off, and you can probably even go down to a 6-inch wrist just depending on how your wrist is configured, and it would still look completely proportional. Going below that, you might need to just be okay with wearing a larger watch, but even still, it does fit pretty well for its size. Moving on to some straps here, I really loved this combo here from King Leathercraft, this nice natural Botero leather. I think the light brown tan coloration just works perfectly with the black tones of the Speedmaster, adds a little bit of color to it and makes it casual, but I guess slightly dressier than the bracelet. Either way, I think it looks great. And there we have it. Surprisingly, although everyone says the Speedmaster is such a strap monster and whatnot, I actually do like it more on its bracelet. I don't know why the straps aren't completely appealing to me. I don't know if it's because it is a larger watch, the 42mm stance. I don't know if it's these lyre lugs. I don't quite know how to put my finger on it, but for some reason I do still think the bracelet looks best on this watch. But if you want to switch it up with some straps, you can definitely do that. For a nice super casual look, we have this Colareb strap. It is this somewhat grayish oatmeal type color, and I think it works perfectly with the slightly greener leaning Lume. Overall, dresses down the watch a lot, makes it a lot more muted, and it's nice. To me, this strap does make the watch feel almost a little bit more vintage, and I think that's just a testament to the fact that, you know, this design hasn't really changed much since its original inception in the 1960s, and using straps like this and tones like this, it really brings out that old world feel out of the watch itself. Next, a super fun look, we have this Barton Elite silicone strap in green. Plays off the slightly green tone of the Lume here, and of course just makes it a little bit more sporty. And although the watch doesn't have a lot of water resistance, I mean, it is a nice kind of summer option for the watch. It adds a little bit of texture, adds a little bit more color to the watch. Again, it's just super fun. If you don't want to necessarily sweat through your leather straps in the summer, you don't want to wear the bracelet, then this rubber is a pretty good option. And lastly, the Archer silicone strap. I think it looks pretty good. Of course, it's a monochrome watch overall, except the little tiny hints of green in there. But because all the hands are white, I think it still does tie in pretty well with the white strap. Even the kind of print on the tachymeter scale is more white leaning. So I think it pairs well, looks good, and of course, super comfortable. Plants the watch really well, makes it wear pretty close to the wrist. So yeah, if for some reason the bracelet's not fitting your fancy, the watch looks fantastic on this strap too. So you have plenty of options. Taking a look at the Lume here, as you can see, it glows pretty well. You have all the markers, all the indices loomed, and the tiny little tip of the running chronograph hand loomed. So the legibility is pretty good. All the Lume application is pretty evenly applied overall. You have the nice little marker at 12, which delineates pretty easily which kind of way is up on the watch. The Lume lasts a pretty good amount of time, and overall I don't really have much complaints with it. Comparing the Speedmaster to the little Timex Snoopy here, as you can see, they are kind of similarly bright. Of course, Timex just has a little bit more surface area, but they're both legible. The Speedmaster does hold up pretty well, and it's nice to see that even though they are pretty small Lume plots, they do shine pretty nicely. So pros and cons of this watch. I think one of the biggest pros is going to be surprisingly the size. especially when I used to try on the older version of the Speedmaster with the older bracelet, it didn't fit my wrist. It is a 42mm watch, so it's not small by any means, but with the male end links, with the larger lug to lug, it just did not fit my wrist the way I wanted it to. Trying on this new version with the overall smaller dimensions in almost every way, the more tapering bracelet, it just now fits and now feels right and now looks proportional, I think. And that's surprising for a 42mm watch. It is probably one of the best wearing 42s I've tried, maybe outside of some like Seikos or whatnot. Written off the Speedmaster based off just pure dimensions like I have for a long time, I would say go try one on first because it does wear well. Just really quickly touching on the bracelet, it is fantastic. It wears a lot better than the old one. It feels nice on wrist. It tapers nicely. Some people might not like the dramatic taper. I do. I think it helps balance the watch a little bit more. So yeah, I really like the bracelet. A big pro for the watch is the new movement. It is upgraded. It's now METAS certified. It now has the coaxial escapement in it. So there is really no con to the new upgraded movement. It looks fantastic. It looks classic. It is one of the most iconic chronographs out there. And now it's just better in every way, technically. So it's nice to see the movement upgraded. It is quite an expensive watch now, relatively, but even then, I mean, it still is a luxury watch. And last but not least, it's just hard to argue it's iconic. It has a nice clean black dial. It will match most things. I'm sure it doesn't have the most water resistance, but even still, I don't take any of my watches in the water really anyway. So it can easily be your only watch for the rest of your life, and I think that is a definite pro. So moving on to cons and kind of backpacking off the last thought. Is that the right term? We'll go with that. It's a little plain. It's, yes, iconic. It is, yes, classic, but it's just a matte black dial. There's not really much else to it. Sure, it has the depth of the subdial. Sure, it is kind of stepped around the edges, but it's still a little plain. I would like to see there be more variation in the Speedmaster standard range, I would say. Yes, it's not as true to form, but very few people are taking Speedmasters to space in the first place. It'd be nice to see a black dial, a white dial, a blue dial, a green dial, you know, or whatever. There'd be more variation. Sure, with the new, I think, Speedmaster 57 it's called, they introduced more colors, but why can't I have a similar kind of variety with the base Speedmaster design? So that's just one thing I think is a con for the watch in general and the, I guess, range in general as well. Secondly, there's not really much micro adjust in the watch. I believe it was 2 holes. I don't have the watch in front of me. And that's not a lot at all. If you went through the effort to even include micro adjust, include more. And lastly, I think you can just say it's not the necessarily best value for money watch out there. Kind of dial lacks luxury refinement in a way. It is very much a tool-looking watch, and it is based off a tool-based task. So I understand that. I understand trying to keep true to the original, and I understand there's other watches in the range that fill that luxury void better. But with this standard version, if they added more variations, it can be a little bit more luxurious, a little bit more worthy of its price point. Because as it stands, there's probably a lot more for the price under you can get that shines a little bit more, feels a little bit more premium. But even that being said, there's not a lot of other true mechanical chronographs out there, so it is what it is. Final thoughts on the watch and the Speedmaster, it's great. It's one of those ones where it was actually my first ever kind of goal to own. It was a watch that I lusted after. It was a watch that I first saw on like some random TV show and thought that looked really nice. And I was sad trying one on because it didn't fit right and I didn't like the way it fit. But now with this new version, it kind of everything comes together and it works a lot better. The bracelet fits better. The case just works better on my wrist. And I think if you've been put off from Speedmasters in the past, you should definitely go back and try this one because a lot of things have been improved. If you don't like the design as it is, you're not going to like this watch. It's just how it is. If you're more of a sub guy than a Speedmaster guy, the Speedmaster is not going to appeal to you. But as it stands, it's still a very iconic watch. It still is good looking. It can still, again, as I said earlier, fit that one watch for the rest of your life role. My main kind of gripe with the Speedmaster and the reason why I don't own one yet, I mean I will at some point, but it's just more to the fact that they're kind of a dime a dozen. They're very common watches. It's a very prevalent design. It's looked the same for decades. So there's a lot of them out there, and that almost pushes me to the point of like, I don't need to get one now. The watch design will always be there. It will continue to exist for decades in the future, and if not centuries, if we're all still here in centuries. And it's a very good watch, but arguably there's other cooler, more interesting watches I'd like to have first. The Speedmaster is very safe and staple design, I would say. So if you don't have staple pieces in your collection already, this is a fantastic place to start. But if you're like me and you like to collect more interesting, weird things half the time, then there's other stuff to get first. But this one is still a fantastic watch. I'm still going to have one day, and I think this is arguably the best version of the watch that has existed yet. At the end of the day, those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Again, as always, thank you for watching. I hope you got something out of the video, and I'll see you in another one.